Welcome, listeners. Step into the dark with me. In today's broadcast, we are going to navigate the treacherous waters of hindsight. We are going to examine 5 isolated moments frozen in time. 5 seemingly mundane photographs and pieces of digital media that, at first glance, show nothing more than ordinary people living ordinary lives. But, if you look a little closer, if you understand the horrific context behind the lens, you will realize that these images capture the absolute precipice of disaster. These are the final documented moments before ordinary lives were completely destroyed by violence, obsession, and unimaginable tragedy. Our first descent takes us to the sprawling, brutal SD architecture of Moscow, Russia. This is the Western complex of continuous education. It was an institution specifically designed for a very particular demographic. It was a holding pen for students deemed too disruptive, too unruly, and too academically disinterested to function within the traditional Russian high school system. It was a place where the system attempted to hammer discipline into the youth, teaching them blue-collar trades like woodworking and masonry. One of the students sent to this complex was an 18-year-old named Andriy Ove. By all outward appearances, Henry was a ghost. He was deeply introverted, a quiet young man who barely spoke a word to his peers. He had been exiled to the Western complex because his attendance record at his previous school was abysmal. And the reason for his absence was simple. Andrew lived entirely inside his computer monitor. While other teenage boys were out navigating the complexities of adolescence, Henry was whittling away every single waking hour of his existence in front of a glowing screen. He had no interest in learning a trade. He had no interest in the real world. The Western complex, with its heavy-handed, no-nonsense educators, was supposed to be the brutal wake-up call that Henry desperately needed. At least, that was the hope. But Henry didn't need the real world, because he had built a massive social circle online. He was deeply active on underground Russian gaming forums. To his internet friends, who knew him only by his digital avatars, he was a completely ordinary guy. A user named Margarita described him as having a sharp, if somewhat dark, sense of humor. But the internet is a house of mirrors. When you interact with a mind through a monitor, you can never truly be sure what lurks behind the screen. Andrew wasn't just playing video games. He was absorbing them into his very identity. On the forums, his chosen avatar was Walter Sullivan, the fanatical, deeply disturbed serial killer from the psychological horror game Silent Hill 4. The Room. In the digital world of the game, Walter is a calm, shy murderer who carves numbers into the flesh of his victims before ultimately ending his own life by severing the artery in his neck. What his online friends didn't realize was that Andrew wasn't just a fan of Walter Sullivan. He idolized him. He wanted to be him. As the bitter winter of 2017 approached, Andreas' online messages began to curdle into something distinctly sinister. He started complaining bitterly about his health and safety lecturer, a 44-year-old man named Sergei Danilov. Mr. Danilov was exactly the kind of man the Western complex employed to deal with unruly youths. He was a former military officer, a stern father of 3, and a man who absolutely did not tolerate backtalk, apathy, or tardiness. Naturally, Andreas' constant slacking and blatant disrespect during lectures became the catalyst for massive, escalating friction between the two. The conflict reached a boiling point. The former army officer finally had enough and initiated the formal paperwork to have Andrew permanently expelled from the Polytechnic. Sitting in the blue glow of his monitor, Andrew began typing dark promises into the forum chat rooms. "I'm gonna kill that guy sooner or later," he wrote. But in the toxic, edgy culture of online gaming forums, where dark humor is the primary currency, not a single user took him seriously. Such jokes were common on our forum, one user later recounted, haunted by the memory. "We didn't pay those comments much attention." But the users did notice one bizarre anomaly. Andrew began ending every single one of his forum posts with a highly specific, cryptic hashtag, 11,117. When they pressed him on what the numbers meant, Andrew refused to explain. He simply logged off. The meaning became crystal clear when the calendar flipped to November 1st, 2017, 11:17. It was a Wednesday. Andrew walked through the doors of the facility on Givarskaya Street, just as he always did. But he hadn't come to study. During a quiet break period, and silently stalked down the linoleum hallway toward Mr. Danilov's classroom. He peered through the glass. The former army officer was entirely alone, standing at his desk, his back completely facing the doorway. He had a toothpick casually resting in his mouth, and slipped his hand into his coat pocket. He wrapped his fingers around the handle of a heavy kitchen knife he had smuggled from home. He breached the doorway, moving with a terrifying, silent speed. He closed the distance before the teacher could even turn around, and raised the blade and plunged it with catastrophic force directly into Mr. Danilov's neck. The 44-year-old father of three collapsed to the floor, the blade severing his vocal cords, rendering him completely unable to scream for help. As the man bled out on the linoleum, the true horror of Andrei's digital obsession was unleashed. Andrei didn't flee. He didn't panic. He calmly reached into his pocket and pulled out his smartphone. Standing over the dying teacher and reframed the shot, he took 2 selfies. The first, a horrifying, bloody image of his victim that is far too graphic to describe. The second, a chilling portrait of pure sociopath Y. In this image, Andrei is gleefully posing for the camera. He is holding a heavy circular power saw that he had just retrieved from the school's woodworking shop. The toothpick is still casually hanging from his lips. His eyes are dead. He instantly uploaded the images to his VK page, the Russian equivalent of Facebook. He attached a song by the doom metal band November's Doom. He didn't take these photos to brag. He took them to complete his twisted fantasy. He took them as a memento mori. Minutes after uploading the final image, fulfilling his sick idolization of the video game killer Walter Sullivan, and repowered on the circular saw, he raised the spinning blade to his own throat and ended his life. When another teacher finally opened the classroom door, they stepped into a slaughterhouse. The tragedy sent shockwaves through the community. An anonymous student spoke of the fallen Mr. Danilov, their voice cracking with grief. He was a very kind person. He was strict, but he was fair. He was like a father to us. I have no single bad thought about him. Regardless of what was happening, he was our support. He always tried to help us. Russian authorities scoured Andrei's hard drives, eventually claiming he was motivated by a shadowy online death group that encouraged vulnerable youths to participate in lethal challenges. But looking at the final, smiling photograph of Andrei Emelianikov, the truth seems far simpler and much more terrifying. He was a boy who lost the line between the digital nightmare and reality. Our second photograph takes us to the affluent, sun-drenched streets of Barcelona, Spain. But beneath the veneer of wealth and beauty, there exists a forgotten underclass, struggling to survive in the shadows. This is the story of Rosario Andreana. Born in 1954, Rosario, or Charo, as she warmly insisted on being called, grew up fighting against the current of poverty. She was a woman armed with a high IQ, striking good looks, and a fiercely bubbly personality. Against all odds, she clawed her way up, carving out a highly respectable, decent life. In 1981, she married a good man named Louis, and together they welcomed a beautiful daughter, Exanto, into the world. Because of her brilliant fluency in multiple foreign languages, Charo secured a lucrative, prestigious corporate position at the Spanish superstore, Brick. She had one. She had escaped her past. But addiction is a monster that waits in the dark. In 1995, Charo's perfect life fractured. She fell into a destructive, whirlwind romance with an executive from her company, a charismatic Frenchman named Jean. Jean didn't just break her marriage. He introduced her to a chemical nightmare. He got Charo hooked on cocaine. The descent was blindingly fast. The drug consumed her completely. Her work suffered, and she was inevitably fired from the lucrative job she had fought so hard to secure. Then, having had his fun and destroyed her life, Jean callously abandoned Charo on the streets of Paris, leaving her with absolutely nothing but a raging, lifelong addiction to remember him by. Broken and desperate, Charo managed to drag herself back to Barcelona. She begged her husband and daughter for forgiveness, for a second chance, but the damage was too profound. They turned their backs on her. The door was closed. Now, completely homeless, jobless, and isolated, Charo vanished into the unseen margins of the city. For 5 grueling years, the former corporate executive survived by sleeping on a piece of flattened cardboard inside the glass vestibule of a local bank branch. The cruelest irony. The bank was located in the highly affluent Sangiovese neighborhood. It was the very same bank where she had once worked before the drugs took everything. It was the freezing, early hours of December 16th, 2005. Charo, now 51 years old, was huddled under a thin blanket on the hard tile floor of the vestibule. At approximately 1:30 am, the heavy glass door was violently yanked open. The 18-year-old boys, Ricard Panilli and Doriel Planet, stormed into the tiny enclosure. They were drunk, entitled, and filled with a senseless, predatory malice. They looked down at the sleeping woman and began to relentlessly attack her. They hurled vile insults, kicked her ribs, threw garbage onto her makeshift bed, and violently struck her with a heavy plastic bottle and a stolen traffic cone. Laughing, the 2 boys stepped back outside into the freezing night, hunting for larger, heavier objects to bludgeon her with hair. It was in that brief, terrifying moment of respite that the bank's internal security camera captured an image of sheer desperation. The grainy security footage shows Charo, bruised and terrified, rushing to the heavy glass door. She manages to push it shut and engage the internal lock, trapping the 2 predators on the outside. Unable to breach the glass, Ricard and Doriel spat at the door and eventually wandered away into the dark. This was not an isolated incident. For a woman living on the streets, violence was a constant companion. Charo had been beaten by territorial vagrants and angry drunks countless times. She knew from bitter experience that calling the police to report a minor assault on a homeless woman would achieve absolutely nothing. Believing she had weathered the storm and was finally safe behind the locked glass, Charo slowly walked back to her cardboard bed, pulled the blanket up to her chin, and closed her eyes. She had no idea the monsters were coming back. Several hours later, at exactly 4:00 am, a sharp knock echoed against the glass. Charo sat up. Standing outside was a 16-year-old boy named Juan Jose Mera. He looked innocent enough. He politely told Charo that he desperately needed to use the ATM to withdraw cash. Charo, showing a kindness she rarely received, stood up and unlocked the door to let the boy inside. It was a fatal mistake. The moment the lock clicked, the door was violently ripped open. Juan Jose was not alone. He was the bait. He was in cahoots with Ricard and Doriel, who were hiding just out of the camera's sightline. This image, captured by the camera just milliseconds before the breach, is the last documented moment of Charo alive. The 3 youths swarmed the tiny vestibule. The violence escalated to an unimaginable degree. They brutally beat and mocked the 51-year-old woman. Then, Ricard and Juan Jose briefly left the booth, leaving Oriel to guard the bleeding woman. 30 agonizing minutes later, they returned carrying a heavy plastic jug. It contained 25 liters of industrial-grade paint thinner. While Oriel propped the heavy glass door open to ensure their escape, Juan Jose and Ricard unscrewed the cap. They violently doused Charo's body, her clothes, and her cardboard bed in the highly flammable chemical. Ricard stepped back. He pulled a lighter from his pocket, ignited his cigarette, and calmly flicked the burning cherry onto the soaked cardboard. The vestibule erupted into an inferno. The 3 boys sprinted away into the night, laughing hysterically as Charo was instantly engulfed in a massive fireball that burned at a horrifying 400 degrees Celsius. When firefighters arrived minutes later, they found Charo barely clinging to life. 70% of her flesh had been burned away. Despite the desperate efforts of the medical staff, Rosario Andriano succumbed to her agonizing injuries 28 hours later. The bank security camera had captured the entire, barbaric execution in high definition. When the footage was leaked to the public, it sparked a massive, nationwide outrage across Spain. The manhunt was swift. Ricard, Oriel, and Juan Jose were quickly identified, dragged from their affluent homes, and thrown into police custody. The justice system was not the only entity seeking retribution. When Ricard and Doriel were placed in holding cells, they were savagely beaten by the other inmates, disgusted by their cowardice. One of them had his head violently shaved by the prison population. During the trial, The defense attorneys attempted a disgusting, pathetic strategy. They tried to downgrade the charge from premeditated murder to accidental manslaughter, claiming the boys simply wanted to scare her and the cigarette was dropped by mistake. The jury didn't buy a single word of it. The prosecution annihilated their defense by producing a sickening piece of digital evidence. They had extracted video files from Aricard's personal cell phone. The videos showed the trio systematically hunting, attacking, and humiliating other homeless individuals across the city for sport. The dark truth was finally exposed. These boys were not just cruel. They were driven by a twisted, fascist ideology. They deeply despised the homeless population, and they had taken it upon themselves to literally cleanse the streets of Spain with fire. In November 2008, the gavel fell. Ricard and Oriol were each sentenced to 17 years in prison for the intentional, sadistic murder of Charua. Juan Jose, protected by the juvenile court system, received a mere 8 years. Because of the passage of time, all 3 of these killers are now walking the streets as free men. In a sickening twist, Ricard was released early in 2016, serving only 11 years for burning a woman alive. He publicly justified his demonic actions by claiming he was insecure and suffered from low self-esteem. Charua's daughter, Exantel, who watched the footage of her mother burning, spoke a heartbreaking truth. The fire didn't just end a life. It burned the future to ash. Perhaps, on a day like today, my mother could have decided to accept help and become again the woman she had once been, Exantel stated, her voice hollow. But that opportunity was violently taken away from her. Our third image takes us deep into the breathtaking, rugged wilderness of India. This photograph was captured on the afternoon of January 3rd, 2021. The young woman smiling brightly for the camera is Nirupama Prayapati. She was enjoying a vibrant, beautiful day out with her close friends, picnicking near the roaring, scenic waterfalls of Kanakund. The area is a massive, awe-inspiring gorge, often referred to as the Grand Canyon of Odisha. The beauty of the landscape is matched only by its profound danger. After finishing their meal, the group decided to venture down the steep, jagged rocks toward the banks of the raging Nib River. They wanted to capture the majesty of the churning rapids for their social media pages. The photograph you see was taken mere moments before the world tilted on its axis. Immediately after this picture was snapped, Nirupama turned away from her friends. She moved closer to the absolute edge of the wet, moss-covered rocks, desperate to capture the perfect, breathtaking selfie with the waterfall raging directly behind her. Another friend in the group, filming the scenery with their phone, inadvertently captured the nightmare that followed. Just a few feet away from Nirupama, an unidentified man was also balancing precariously on the slippery rocks, completely absorbed in his own phone screen, trying to take a selfie. The man shifted his weight. His foot slipped on the slick stone. As he failed wildly to regain his balance, he violently bumped into Nirupama's shoulder. The impact was entirely accidental, but the kinetic force was devastating. Nirupama's feet instantly slid out from under her. She plummeted off the rocky ledge, plunging directly into the violent, churning rapids of the Ib River below. The water in that specific section of the gorge was deceptively shallow, but the hydraulic pressure of the current was monolithic. For a few agonizing, terrifying seconds, Nirupama managed to break the surface. She desperately clawed at the wet stones, fighting with every ounce of strength she possessed to pull herself out of the meat grinder. Her friends screamed, reaching out for her, but they were too far away. The current was too powerful. The river violently ripped her grip from the stone, pulling her under the white water and violently sweeping her downstream toward the massive falls. A massive, frantic search operation was immediately launched. The local fire brigade, alongside her terrified loved ones, spent 22 grueling, agonizing hours dragging the dangerous river. The following day, their worst fears were confirmed. Nirupama's broken remains were discovered trapped in a deep stone crevice, wedged violently beneath a massive boulder over 400 meters downstream. She had been carried directly over the jagged lip of the waterfall. It is a tragedy that feels uniquely modern. Nirupama's death is not an isolated incident. It is part of a terrifying, rapidly accelerating epidemic in India. In recent years, the pursuit of digital validation has evolved into a lethal hazard. Tourists have plummeted from sheer cliffs, been obliterated by speeding trains, and been violently mauled by apex predators, all while staring into the lenses of their smartphones, trying to capture the perfect selfie. The statistics are absolutely staggering. A comprehensive study published by the Journal of Travel Medicine revealed a deeply unsettling truth. Over a 13-year period, there were at least 379 documented fatal incidents directly linked to taking selfies. To put that number into perspective, that is exponentially higher than the 90 fatal shark attacks recorded globally during that exact same time frame. The psychology is terrifying. The intoxicating dopamine rush of social media validation causes individuals to completely override their primal survival instincts. They willingly step onto crumbling ledges. They bypass safety barriers, and they ignore the roaring warning signs of nature, prioritizing likes over their own continued existence. And of all the nations on Earth, India has become the epicenter of this bizarre digital plague. The country accounts for a massive 26% of all global selfie-related fatalities, completely dwarfing the United States, which sits at 10.3%. The body count has become so severe that the Indian government has been forced to intervene. They are now actively implementing strict no-selfie zones across the country, heavily guarding areas with steep drop-offs, violent bodies of water, inactive train tracks. These measures are a desperate attempt to force society to put the screens down, to look at the world through their own eyes, rather than a digital filter. It is a grim reminder that when you step to the edge of the abyss for a photograph, sometimes the abyss pushes back. For our final photograph, we must navigate the hyper-manicured, fiercely guarded world of the South Korean music industry. Depending on your musical palate, K-pop is either a flawless, glittering triumph of modern entertainment or a heavily synthesized, manufactured product. But regardless of your opinion on the music itself, the industry that produces these idols harbors an undeniable, deeply dark underbelly. Behind the perfectly synchronized choreography and the blinding strobe lights, young performers are subjected to a regime that borders on the draconian. They endure notoriously grueling, inhuman training schedules. They are starved to maintain impossible physical standards. They face extreme psychological pressure and are ruthlessly discarded the moment their popularity dips. Idols who dare to speak out about the exploitation are aggressively silenced by their massive agencies, threatened with financial ruin and crippling lawsuits. But sometimes the intense, suffocating pressure of that environment forges incredibly deep, profound bonds of sisterhood. This brings us to Ladies Code. They were a highly promising K-pop quintet, formed in 2012. The original lineup consisted of 5 young women: Soyoung, Guny, Eunb, Rise, and their designated leader, Ashley. While they hadn't yet reached the monolithic, global status of the industry titans, they were widely considered to be rapidly rising stars, boasting several impressive early hits that had captured the public's attention. We may never fully know the extent of the pressure they faced behind closed doors at their agency, Polaris Entertainment. But what is absolutely undeniable is the unbreakable, profound connection these 5 women shared. They weren't just colleagues. They were a family forged in the fires of the industry. And within that family, the 2 brightest lights were Ryu and Rise. They were roommates, best friends, and entirely inseparable. Whether they were performing under the harsh stadium lights or hiding in the back of a tour bus, they were always side by side. Which makes this photograph so incredibly haunting. This image was posted to Ashley's official Twitter page. It shows all 5 women, exhausted but genuinely happy, smiling brightly for the camera. It is the very last photograph ever taken of the complete Ladies Code lineup. Just hours after this image was uploaded to the internet, the unthinkable tore their world apart. It was the evening of September 2nd, 2014. The group was in the city of Daegu, South Korea, recording a high-energy performance for the massive KBS Live Open concert broadcast. After the stadium lights went dark and the adrenaline began to fade, the 5 exhausted young women, along with one of their stylists, climbed into the back of a heavy, agency-provided passenger van. Behind the wheel sat their road manager, a man identified in the police report simply as Mr. Punt. They began the long, grueling doctor back to the capital city of Seoul. Shortly after midnight, the calendar officially flipped to September 3rd. It was So Young's 21st birthday. The van pulled into a desolate rest stop. While So Young was in the bathroom, Herb and mates frantically assembled a makeshift birthday cake out of cheap choco pies. When she returned, they surprised her in the dark parking lot, singing and laughing. But the cruel realities of their industry dictated their next move. Terrified of being reprimanded by their agency for gaining weight, the girls blew out the candles but refused to eat a single bite of the cake. It was a minor decision that So Young would later agonize over in the years to come. They piled back into the van. It was approximately 1:00 am. The weather had violently turned. A torrential downpour was hammering the asphalt of the Yangdong Expressway, creating incredibly slick, treacherous driving conditions. Despite the rain, Mr. Park was pushing the heavy van to its absolute limits. He was hammering the accelerator, pushing 85 miles per hour in a strictly marked 60 zone, desperately trying to get the idols back to Seoul on schedule. As the van approached the Singer Junction just outside the city limits, disaster struck. The heavy tires lost traction on the flooded asphalt. The van began to violently hydroplane, skidding out of control across the slick highway. Mr. Park yanked the steering wheel, but the heavy vehicle was entirely at the mercy of physics. Witnesses on the highway watched in absolute horror as the van spun wildly, caught the edge of the pavement, and violently barrel rolled multiple times before smashing with catastrophic force into the steel guardrail. The impact crushed the chassis. Mr. Park, miraculously maintaining consciousness despite the violent rollover, kicked his door open and frantically dialed emergency services. Of the 7 occupants strapped inside the mangled steel, 4, including Ashley and Zuny, managed to crawl through the shattered windows and stagger onto the dark highway, waving down passing headlights. But 3 members remained trapped deep inside the crushed rear of the van. UNB, Rise, and the birthday girl, So Young, were completely unconscious. In a horrifying display of gross negligence, an investigation later revealed that not a single airbag inside the passenger cabin had deployed upon impact. Furthermore, a traumatized first responder later testified that when he crawled into the wreckage to pull the girls out, he did not recall having to unbuckle a single seatbelt. The scene was a chaotic nightmare of screaming sirens and pouring rain. First responders found Rise completely unresponsive. She had stopped breathing entirely. Paramedics violently pulled her from the van and initiated frantic CPR right there on the wet asphalt. Ambulances scattered, rushing the 7 occupants to multiple trauma centers across the region. But for 21-year-old UNB, the damage was simply too catastrophic. She was officially pronounced dead on arrival at the St. Vincent's Medical Center. So Young and Rise had absorbed the brunt of the kinetic force. They were rushed into emergency trauma bays in absolutely critical condition. As the hours bled by, Rise's condition rapidly deteriorated. Her brain was swelling heavily from the impact. She was urgently transferred to the EU University Hospital, where neurosurgeons desperately drilled into her skull to relieve the massive pressure. But the trauma was insurmountable, for agonizing days, fans across the globe held their breath. On the morning of September 7th, 2014, Rise succumbed to her massive injuries and passed away. So Young, after multiple grueling surgeries, eventually stabilized. The physical wounds would heal, but the psychological scars were permanent. As the sun rose over the crash site the following morning, the media descended like vultures. Photographers snapped hundreds of pictures of the crushed, blood-stained van. And in one of those photographs, keen-eyed fans noticed a heartbreaking, devastating detail lying in the wet debris on the side of the highway. It was a small, bright yellow bin and a plush toy. It was UNB's favorite possession, a gift given to her by a dedicated fan. She had spoken about it in glowing terms during interviews, mentioning that she always slept with it on the tour bus whenever the crushing loneliness of the industry became too much to bear. It had been violently thrown from the van during the rollover. The tragedy was compounded by the absolute depravity of the paparazzi during the heavily guarded funerals for the 2 young women. Photographers actively ignored the family's desperate pleas for privacy. They shoved their telephoto lenses past security, aggressively snapping close-up, intrusive photos of the weeping, traumatized surviving bandmates as they buried their sisters. the legal fallout was swift. In court, Mr. Park desperately tried to shift the blame, testifying that a mechanical failure, a detached rear wheel, had caused the violent skid, but automotive forensics completely dismantled his lie. The wheel had been violently ripped off because of the impact with the guardrail, not before. He was convicted of fatal negligence and speeding. He was sentenced to a year and 2 months in a prison cell. In a move that deeply angered the public, his sentence was later suspended in 2015, reduced to a mere 40 hours of mandated driving classes after he quietly settled out of court with the grieving families. The K-pop industry moved on, as it always does. But for the 3 surviving members of Ladies Code, the music had stopped. After a long, agonizing period of physical and mental recovery, Ashley, So-young, and ZUNY bravely stepped back onto the stage. Their first return performance was held in Japan, Rise's homeland. It was a deeply emotional tribute dedicated entirely to the sisters they had lost. It had always been Rise's ultimate dream to perform in Yokohama, a dream she died before realizing. Despite their incredible resilience, the trauma was simply too heavy a burden to carry. When their restrictive contracts with Polaris Entertainment finally expired, the 3 women announced an indefinite hiatus. They walked away from the flashing lights and the screaming crowds, finding it impossible to continue the illusion of joy after what they had survived. The glitz, the glamour, the perfect choreography, it all rings hollow when you know the cost. The final photograph of the 5 smiling women remains a haunting digital monument, a reminder that in the blink of an eye, the music can abruptly, violently end. Step into the dark with me. Listeners, settle in, lock your doors, and let the noise of the outside world fade away. We navigate our daily lives clinging to a fragile, invisible thread. It is the unspoken social contract, the baseline of human decency that dictates we look out for one another. Or, at the very least, that we don't treat human life as something disposable. We want to believe that the strangers passing us on the street share this fundamental understanding. But every now and then you peer into the abyss of a criminal case that takes that comforting illusion, shatters it against the pavement, and leaves you staring at the jagged pieces. Tonight, we are going to examine a collection of these fractures. These are the kinds of stories that don't merely disturb your sleep. They force you to confront the terrifying reality of what human beings are capable of when no one is watching. Or, in some twisted modern nightmares, what they are capable of when everyone is watching. Our first journey takes us to the sun-baked asphalt of Central California, the summer of 2017. The air outside of Los Banos was thick and heavy, but inside a moving Buick, the atmosphere was chaotic, reckless, and entirely out of control. Behind the wheel sat 18-year-old Julia Sanchez. She was highly intoxicated, her foot heavy on the accelerator, pushing the vehicle to dangerous speeds. But her attention was not on the road unwinding before her. In her hand, she balanced a smartphone, broadcasting her joyride live to her followers on social media. Sitting in the back seat, completely unbuckled, were Julia's 14-year-old sister, Jacqueline, and Jacqueline's girlfriend, Manuela. They were supposed to be on a simple road trip from Fresno to Stockton. As the Buick tore down Henry Miller Road, Julia was performing for an invisible audience. She stared into the glowing lens of her phone, laughing hysterically, singing along to the music, shouting to her viewers, and dangerously lifting her hands off the steering wheel. The vehicle was a heavy, speeding missile, and the driver was entirely consumed by the digital reflection of herself. The physics of a speeding car do not care about your social media presence. In a split second, Julia lost control. The Buick violently swerved off the asphalt. It plowed through a rusted barbed wire fence, the metal tearing at the car's body, before launching into a horrific, violent rollover. The car flipped end over end at least twice, a chaotic blender of shattered glass, crushing metal, and pure kinetic terror. When the violent motion finally ceased, the dust settled over the mangled wreck. Julia, dazed and disoriented, dragged herself to consciousness, but the back seat was entirely empty. Because they had not been wearing seatbelts, the violent centrifugal force of the rollover had ejected both 14-year-old Jacqueline and her girlfriend, Manuela, directly through the shattering rear window. This is the moment where any shred of human instinct should have taken over. the moment where panic, grief, and a desperate plea for medical salvation should have been the only priorities. But the live stream had never stopped, and neither did OBD Yulia's performance. Instead of dropping the phone to administer aid, she kept the camera rolling. As she stumbled out of the wreckage, her voice echoed out to her digital audience. "Hey everybody. If I go to fucking jail for life, you already know why," she announced. The tone bizarrely conversational given the carnage surrounding her. "My sister is fucking dying. This is the last thing I wanted to happen. Okay. Alright. I don't care though. I'ma hold it down. I love you. Rest in peace, sweetie. If you don't survive, baby, I'm so sorry." It was a chilling monologue of self-preservation and performative grief. OBD Yulia approached the broken body of her little sister. Jacqueline lay entirely motionless in the field. She had suffered a catastrophic, skull-fracturing injury. Her brain was visibly exposed to the California air. OBD Yulia aimed her camera directly down at her sister's face as her life slipped away. She broadcasted the gaping, fatal wound in horrific close-up detail for her viewers to consume. When she finally managed to dial 911, the operator was met with a chaotic, unhinged refusal to cooperate. When the dispatcher desperately pleaded for their location so they could dispatch life-saving paramedics, OBD Yulia's response was void of accountability. "I don't care where I'm at," she snapped into the receiver. When the operator begged for directions, OBD Yulia coldly replied, "I don't know. You're the government. You should know how to find me." By sheer luck, passing witnesses had witnessed the cloud of dust and dialed emergency services, guiding them to the twisted metal. But time had already run out. By the time the sirens wailed and the paramedics rushed the field, 14-year-old Jacqueline was gone. Manuela was rushed to the trauma center with severe, crushing injuries to her legs. When law enforcement approached OBD Yulia, she was a whirlwind of erratic, belligerent fury. She shoved the officers, spat venomous curses at the very people trying to secure the scene, and kicked an EMT directly in the face. She coldly referred to her deceased little sister as an effing toe tag, entirely consumed by the fear that her parents were going to kill her. She had to be physically restrained and hauled away. She was slapped with gross vehicular manslaughter while intoxicated and child endangerment. The live stream, originally viewed by only a handful of people, exploded into a viral, international nightmare. Millions eventually watched the horrifying footage. During her trial, her defense was a sickening masterclass in modern digital narcissism. She claimed she continued to stream her sister's agonizing death because she knew she had a large following, and it was the only way to crowdsource a decent burial for her family. Prosecutors saw right through the veil. This wasn't a desperate act of fundraising. It was a lethal manifestation of main character syndrome, a psychological rot where engagement metrics hold more value than the blood in your sister's veins. Ultimately, she pleaded no contest. The judge handed down a 6-year sentence. She served a mere 26 months before the state released her on parole. To the public, OBD Yulia Sanchez was the terrifying, physical embodiment of social media addiction. In later interviews, she casually referred to pulling her phone out as a reflex that entirely overrode the biological imperative to save her sibling. Her own family was shattered, but not entirely surprised. Her uncle Jose delivered a devastatingly blunt assessment. He revealed that he had warned her father years prior, when OBD Yulia was just 12, that a profound darkness was growing inside of her. "She's dead to me now," he stated to the press. "If she dies tomorrow, I don't care. She's a very bad person." The system's leniency proved fatal. Less than 30 days after her early release, OBD Yulia was behind the wheel again, leading California police on a terrifying, high-speed chase that ended in yet another violent crash. Officers pulled a loaded firearm from the wreckage. Yet, somehow, the gears of justice turned favorably for her again. By 2022, she was walking free. She immediately returned to the digital stage. The remorse was non-existent. She posted videos of herself drinking alcohol inside moving vehicles, flaunting luxury cars, and making sick, twisted jokes about her dark side. She openly mocked her sister's death on live streams and dared internet critics to drop a pin if they wanted to confront her over her lethal DUI. She sought confrontation, and eventually, the confrontation found her. In the freezing December of 2025, the cycle of violence reached its term and end. On a quiet residential street in Stockton, OBD Yulia Sanchez was gunned down in a drive-by shooting. Her body was found riddled with bullets. Authorities remained tight-lipped regarding the suspect or the motive, leaving the public to debate whether it was a random act of street violence or the inevitable, karmic conclusion of a life lived recklessly. It was a tragedy for a family that had now buried two daughters, but across the digital landscape she cherished so much, you would be hard-pressed to find anyone referring to the victim as an innocent soul. We pivot now, moving from the chaotic, selfish violence of a California highway to the sterile, cold, bureaucratic indifference of an international airport. Many of us hold a deep, protective instinct for the elderly in our lives. We desperately hope that when they venture out into the world alone, the strangers they encounter will treat their fragility with patience and dignity. But institutions are not people. They do not possess a conscience. Fermin Delgado Pindu was a man who had spent the vast majority of his life working the soil of Peru. Born in the spring of 1933, Fermin was universally beloved by those who knew him. He was a gentle, quiet soul, a devoted patriarch who found immense peace in fishing the coastal waters and embarking on long, wandering walks. His internal compass was legendary. No matter how far he strayed, he always found his way back home. By 2011, his daughters and granddaughters had migrated to Chile. Fermin, yearning to be close to his bloodline, packed his life and followed them, moving into a home in Peñalolén. Even as he crept through his late 70s, he fiercely protected his independence. He was sharp, highly lucid, and entirely self-sufficient. There was no dementia, no cognitive fog. In March of 2018, his daughter Lily was celebrating a milestone, her 25th wedding anniversary. Her husband had orchestrated a surprise family reunion trip back to the bustling city of Lima, Peru. When the 85-year-old Fermin caught wind of the excursion, he adamantly insisted on joining. He felt the heavy tick of the clock. He believed this might be his final opportunity to see his extended Peruvian relatives. Because it was a last-minute addition, Fermin's travel itinerary was fractured. He secured a seat alongside his daughter for the outbound flight to Lima, but for the return journey to Chile, the old man would have to navigate a completely different flight on his own. Lily was understandably fraught with anxiety. The labyrinthine chaos of international air travel is stressful for a seasoned businessman, let alone an 85-year-old traveling solo. But representatives for LATAM Airlines offered a comforting guarantee. They promised Lily that her father would not be left to his own devices. They assured her that the moment the plane touched down in Santiago, staff would escort him into a wheelchair, guide him safely through the complex customs checkpoints, retrieve his luggage, and hand-deliver him to the waiting arms of his family in the arrivals hall. Trusting the institution, Lily attached a physical credential sheet to her father's clothing, a piece of paper listing his name, his home address, and her direct phone number, hugged him tightly, and watched him walk through the departure gates in Lima. Hours later, at the Arturo Merino Benitez International Airport in Chile, several of Fermin's family members stood eagerly at arrival gate 4. Fermin's flight was scheduled to touch down at 5:30 p.m. The minutes ticked by. In our post, the steady stream of weary travelers filtered through the sliding doors, but the familiar face of the gentle old man never appeared. Because Fermin did not carry a cell phone, the family swallowed their rising panic, assuming it was a standard aviation delay. But as the first ob led into the second, the confusion curdled into absolute dread. They approached the airport staff, desperate for an update. The response they received was a wall of cold, unyielding apathy. The staff refused to even confirm if the LATAM flight had successfully landed. They barred the family from entering the baggage claim to search. They vehemently rejected the simple request to page his name over the intercom system. They just told the frantic family to sit down and wait. With nowhere else to turn, they called Lily, who was sitting in the Lima airport waiting to board her own later flight. Lily confirmed the horrifying truth. Fermin had boarded his plane. It had departed exactly on schedule. He should be standing right in front of them. For the next 4 hours, Lily sat trapped in a pressurized metal tube thousands of feet in the air, tortured by the unknown, wondering if her father had suffered a medical emergency or simply vanished. When Lily finally landed in Santiago, the nightmare remained static. The airport staff were just as obstructive. The family abandoned protocol. They fractured into search parties, scouring every inch of the public terminal. One relative stood scanning the taxi pickup lanes for so long that aggressive security guards physically removed her from the premises for loitering. It was during this desperate hunt that they stumbled upon a chilling clue. Sitting entirely alone in a wheelchair, tucked away in a corner, was a distressed, elderly woman. She told Fermin's family that she had flown in from Colombia. She, too, had been explicitly promised airline assistance, but the staff had simply wheeled her into a corner and abandoned her for hours. A security guard had eventually approached her and delivered a brutal dose of realities. "Ma'am, stand up and leave," he had told her. "They're gonna leave you sitting here for hours. They usually do this. They leave people here and never come back." The implication froze the blood in their veins. Had the airline simply dumped an 85-year-old man in the middle of an international transit hub and walked away? Under intense, relentless pressure, the airport authorities finally cracked. They admitted that Fermin's flight had landed perfectly on time. They spun a vague narrative about a baggage delay, claiming the old man had simply grown impatient, stood up from his assigned wheelchair, and wandered off into the terminal on his own. The anonymous employee who was supposedly tasked with his care vanished into the bureaucracy, never facing public scrutiny. But the silent, unblinking eyes of the CCTV cameras told the devastating final chapters of Fermin's story. The footage showed the 85-year-old man wandering aimlessly through the cavernous terminal. He had no luggage. He paused frequently, slowly turning in circles, scanning the sea of rushing strangers, looking for a familiar face. The footage tracked him as he exited the sliding glass doors into the cool night air. He approached the chaotic taxi rank. An official, registered driver offered him a ride, but Fermin, perhaps confused, perhaps unwilling to be a burden, politely waved him off. Minutes later, the cameras caught him approaching an individual wearing a high-visibility neon transit vest. Fermin asked the question. The worker pointed a finger off into the distance. Fermin nodded and obediently began walking in the exact direction the stranger indicated. That worker never came forward to explain where he had sent the old man. The final haunting frames of footage showed Fermin standing patiently in line at a dark bus stop. After a long wait, he stepped out of the queue, turned his back to the airport, and simply began to walk. The path he chose fed directly into Route 68, a massive, dangerous, high-speed highway connecting Santiago to Valparaiso. The family rushed to the police to file a missing persons report. The authorities essentially shrugged. They refused to officially validate the report for 5 agonizing days. They told the weeping family to come back only if they had definitive proof that the old man was in active danger. LATAM Airlines washed their hands of the incident. The airport management deflected all blame. The institution decided that their liability evaporated the moment Fermin stood up. For days, the family hunted alone. They plastered the city with flyers, knocked on strange doors, scoured hospital trauma wards, and checked the sterile drawers of the local morgues. The sightings trickled in. A security guard, who thought he saw an old man wandering near a metro station, heading toward Mapocho. But what the family discovered during their relentless search was a hidden, terrifying epidemic. As they combed the streets, they found multiple other disoriented, elderly individuals living rough in the gutters. And the stories were identical. These fragile people had been picked up at the airport by predatory, illegal taxi drivers. The moment the drivers realized the confused elderly passengers didn't possess enough cash to cover an exorbitant fare, they simply pulled over, dragged them out of the vehicle, and dumped them on the side of the road in the middle of nowhere, leaving them to the mercy of the elements and the criminal street gangs that forced the vulnerable into begging. Fermin Delgado Pindu vanished with a mere 9,000 pesos in his pocket, the equivalent of about $15. He was never seen again. Whether his heart simply gave out on the side of a dusty highway, or whether he was swallowed by the unseen, predatory underbelly of the city, his fate was sealed by the staggering, breathtaking indifference of the people paid to protect him. To this day, his family clings to a rapidly fading ember of hope, but the tragic reality remains: a beloved patriarch evaporated into the wind because the system simply didn't care enough to watch him. For our third case, we travel to the humid, manicured lawns of Florida. It was the morning of May 26th, 1990. The setting was the Aero Club, a highly exclusive, eccentric neighborhood in Wellington where the driveways doubled as taxiways, allowing wealthy residents to pull their private aircraft directly into hangars attached to their sprawling backyards. Inside one of these affluent homes, 40-year-old Marlene Warren was enjoying a lazy Saturday morning. Her husband Michael was out of town on a trip. Keeping her company was her 21-year-old son Joseph, who was laid up with a broken leg, and a handful of his friends who had stopped by to keep his spirits high. The smell of fresh coffee and eggs filled the kitchen as they chatted around the table. At exactly 10 o'clock in the morning, the sharp chime of the doorbell cut through the conversation. Marlene stood up, wiping her hands, assuming it was a weekend package delivery or a neighbor stopping by to check on Joe. She pulled open the heavy front door. Standing on the sunlit concrete of her front porch was a figure pulled straight from the realm of the surreal. It was a clown. The individual was completely submerged in costume. They wore a wildly bright, multicolored, oversized clown suit, bright white gloves, and a synthetic, fiery orange afro wig. Their face was painted with thick, white makeup and a garish, classic red nose. In one white-gloved hand, the clown clutched a woven basket overflowing with beautiful red and white carnations. In the other hand, they held two helium balloons. One featured a cheerful scene of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. The second balloon bore a simple, silver inscription: "You're the greatest." For a few fleeting, confusing seconds, the scene must have felt entirely whimsical. Marlene likely assumed it was a prank, a cheerful clownogram ordered by a friend to cheer up her injured son in the living room. Marlene reached out, a soft smile spreading across her face. "How pretty," she murmured, accepting the balloons. They were the very last words she would ever speak. Without a sound, the clown raised their right hand. Clutched tightly in the white glove was a firearm. The clown pointed the barrel directly at Marlene's face and pulled the trigger, shooting her in the mouth at point-blank range. As Marlene collapsed backward onto the tile, bleeding catastrophically, the clown didn't run. They didn't panic. They simply turned on their heel and walked with a terrifying, measured calmness back down the driveway. Joe, who had watched the entire, horrific execution unfold from a nearby window, screamed and scrambled toward the door. As the clown approached a white Chrysler LeBaron convertible idling on the street, they paused. The clown slowly turned their head and locked eyes with the 21-year-old son. Joe would later describe the look to detectives. He couldn't determine the sex or the exact height of the killer beneath the baggy suit, but the eyes burned into his memory. Behind the thick white paint and the bright orange wig were a pair of dark brown, utterly soulless eyes. The clown slid into the LeBaron and drove away. Joe, hampered by his broken leg, was powerless to give chase. Marlene Warren was rushed to the emergency room, but the trauma to her brain was irreversible. 2 days later, as Joe sat weeping by her bedside promising that he would find the monster who did this, the machines were turned off. Marlene slipped away into the dark. The investigation launched immediately, and the physical evidence painted a bizarre trail. The white LeBaron was discovered abandoned in a Winn-Dixie grocery store parking lot roughly 8 miles from the murder scene. Detectives traced the VIN number to a local rental agency called Paylist. The agency had reported the convertible stolen just days prior to the execution. When crime scene technicians dusted the interior of the abandoned car, they found microscopic gold. Clinging to the fabric of the driver's side headrest were bright orange synthetic fibers, a perfect match for a cheap clown wig. More importantly, they recovered several strands of long, dark brown human hair. Canvassing the area, detectives tracked the balloons and carnations to a local Publix supermarket. The cashier vividly remembered the transaction. The buyer was a woman with chocolate brown hair and striking dark brown eyes who had paid entirely in cash. A nearby costume shop corroborated the description, reporting that a woman matching those exact features had purchased a full clown ensemble just a few days before the doorbell rang. The physical evidence was mounting, but the motive pointed directly to the inner circle. Detectives focused their crushers on Marlene's husband, Michael Warren. Michael was the proprietor of a local enterprise called Bargain Auto Rentals. However, the couple's massive estate, valued well over $1 million, was legally held almost entirely in Marlene's name. If she perished, Michael inherited the empire. The financial motive was glaring, but the emotional motive was even darker. Marlene had lived in fear. She had explicitly confided in her children prior to her death, stating with chilling clarity, "If anything happens to me, Mike did it." When Joe tried to comfort her, insisting his stepfather wasn't capable of murder, Marlene had coldly replied, "Don't put it past him." The circumstantial links to Michael were damning. In his local newspaper advertisements, Michael heavily utilized the phrase "pay less" in massive, bold font. The branding was so ubiquitous that locals simply referred to his lot as Payless. Given that the killer clown's getaway car was stolen from the actual Payless rental agency, it was a geographic and psychological connection too bright to ignore. But Michael held a trump card, an ironclad alibi. At the exact moment the gun fired on his porch, Michael was hours away, traveling toward Miami in a vehicle full of friends who swore to his whereabouts. However, an alibi only proves you didn't pull the trigger. It doesn't prove you didn't buy the gun. Detectives uncovered a deeply disturbing conversation Michael had engaged in with a lawyer a year prior. Michael had presented a hypothetical scenario, asking what would happen to an estate if a husband murdered his wife. When the lawyer explained he would be disinherited, Michael pressed further. He asked what would happen if a friend committed the murder, and the husband couldn't be tied to the conspiracy. The lawyer confirmed that in that scenario, the husband would walk away with everything, scot-free. The police shifted their gaze to Michael's inner circle, landing squarely on a 27-year-old woman named Sheila Keene. Sheila was an employee of Michael's, working as a repo agent for his car lot. She was tall, slender, and possessed a pair of deep, dark brown eyes. Officially, she had no connection to Marlene. They had never even shared a conversation. But unofficially, the entire town knew the truth. Sheila and Michael were engaged in a heavy, passionate affair behind Marlene's back. Sheila vehemently denied the romance to the detectives, but neighbors testified they saw the pair together so frequently, they assumed they were a married couple. Despite the glaring motive and the eyewitness descriptions matching her physical profile, the DNA technology of the early 1990s simply wasn't sophisticated enough to definitively match the brown hairs found in the LeBaron to Sheila. The clown suit was never recovered. The murder weapon vanished. The case went ice cold. But the brazen audacity of the crime lived on. In 2002, 12 years after Marlene bled to death on her foyer tile, Michael Warren and Sheila Keene officially tied the knot. Sheila underwent a bizarre, almost psychological metamorphosis. She dyed her dark brown hair bright blonde. She demanded people call her Debbie, effectively shedding her old identity. The newlyweds opened a burger joint in Tennessee called the Purple Cow. The rumors of her bloody past followed her, but Sheila didn't hide from them. She reveled in them. In a display of breathtaking, sociopathic arrogance, Sheila actually showed up to her restaurant shift on Halloween fully dressed in a clown costume. Employees noted it was one of the only times they ever saw her genuinely smile. For decades, the story of the killer clown of Weddington was traded as a dark, suburban urban legend. But Joe Warren never forgot the soulless eyes. He battled severe substance abuse, struggling to drown the trauma of watching his mother murdered, until he finally fought his way to sobriety, demanding justice. In 2014, the dawn of advanced forensic genealogy changed the game. The Palm Beach County Cold Case Unit cracked the evidence boxes open. Using modern technology, they tested the strands of brown hair recovered from the driver's seat of the LeBaron. The DNA was a definitive, absolute match. It was Sheila Keene Warren. In September of 2017, 27 years after the gunshot rang out, heavily armed agents surrounded Sheila in Virginia and slapped the cuffs on her wrists. She was extradited back to Florida to face first-degree murder charges. But the justice system is a machine of compromise. In April of 2023, facing a mountain of delays and the threat of a death penalty trial, prosecutors offered a plea deal. Sheila pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. The judge handed down a 12-year sentence. But due to a complex web of time served and good behavior credits, Sheila Warren walked out of the prison gates a free woman in November of 2024, having served a mere 18 months behind bars for executing an innocent woman. The most chilling aspect of the crime remains the psychological warfare of the costume itself. Why a clown? Maureen Warren loved clowns. She painted portraits of them. Her home was decorated with small clown statuettes. It was a well-known, personal joy of hers. Sheila Keane, a woman who had never met Marlene, somehow acquired this incredibly intimate detail. Did Michael tell her? Was the costume chosen to disarm the wife, ensuring she opened the door with a smile? Or was it a final, malicious act of cruelty, a mistress ensuring that her rival's final waking moment was a twisted mockery of something she loved? Michael Warren was never charged. The conspiracy remains unproven in the eyes of the law, but the question lingers in the Florida humidity, unresolved and deeply unsettling. We close tonight's episode by plunging into the suffocating, humid depths of a South Carolina summer. The year is 1985. 17-year-old Shari Faye Smith, known affectionately to everyone simply as Shari, was the quintessential girl next door. She was quiet, highly dependable, and a creature of comforting routines. It was the afternoon of May 31st. Shari had just left a lively high school pool party, driving her car back to her family's home on Lake Murray Boulevard in Lexington County. At 3:38 p.m., Shari's father, Bob, glanced out the front window of the house. Then he saw his daughter's car successfully pull into the long, gravel driveway, coming to a stop directly beside the roadside mailbox. Satisfied she was home, Bob turned away to continue his afternoon, fully expecting the front door to open within seconds. 5 minutes ticked by. The house remained silent. Confused, Bob walked out the front door and down the driveway. Shari's car was idling. The engine was humming smoothly. The driver's side door was swung wide open. The mail was scattered haphazardly across the dirt around the mailbox. Sitting undisturbed on the passenger seat was Shari's purse, and most alarmingly, her critical diabetes medication, a lifeline she would never run with her husband, under any circumstances willingly abandon. But the 17-year-old girl had vanished into thin air. Bob and his wife, Hilda, frantically dialed the police. The agonizing, suffocating panic of a missing child descended upon the house. For 2 days, they lived in a silent hell. And then, the phone rang. The voice on the other end of the line was male. It was incredibly calm, meticulously measured, but heavily distorted, likely muffled by a rag or an electronic device over the receiver. The caller stated simply that he had kidnapped Shari, but offered a cruel sliver of hope. He claimed she was still alive, comfortably watching television. He instructed the weeping parents to check their mail, and then the line went dead. The letter arrived. It wasn't a ransom note demanding cash. It wasn't a collage of magazine clippings. It had been written by Shari herself, in her own distinctive, looping handwriting. The title at the top of the page froze the blood of the investigators' last will and testament. The killer had forced a terrified teenager to sit down and pen her own final goodbye to the world. But despite the coercion, the words were undeniably Shari's. It was a heartbreaking, agonizingly brave document filled with pure expressions of love for her family, a plea for them not to despair, and a final, haunting request that they hold a closed casket funeral. The phone calls did not stop. The killer had locked his jaws into the psychology of the Smith family, and he refused to let go. "Do you believe me now?" The distorted voice taunted over the line. "Well, I'm not really sure I believe you," the desperate mother pleaded, "because I haven't heard any word from Shari, and I need to know that Shari is well." "You'll know in 2 or 3 days," the voice replied. "Why 2 or 3 days?" "Call the search off." Over the next agonizing week, the phantom caller tormented the family. He spoke in cryptic, quasi-religious riddles, heavily implying that Shari was still drawing breath. He would read lines from her last will over the phone, savoring the power he held. "Became one soul," the voice whispered into the receiver during a 4:00 call. brushing aside the mother's desperate pleas for her daughter's life with a chilling sign-off. "Lovin' miss you. Get good rest tonight. Goodbye." He was a predator feeding on raw anguish, operating under the delusion that he was a god deciding the fate of mortals. 6 days after snatching the teenager from her driveway, the game changed. He called one final time, abandoning the riddles for terrifyingly precise coordinates. "Take Highway 378 west to traffic circle," the voice commanded. "Take Prosperity exit. Go 1.5 miles. Turn right at sign Moose Lodge No. 103. Go a 1/4 mile. Turn left at White Frame Building. Go to backyard. 6 feet beyond. We're waiting. God chose us." The coordinates lead the tactical teams directly into a dense, overgrown wooded area in Saluda County. There, hidden in the brush, they found the lifeless body of Shari Faye Smith. Forensics determined she had been murdered a mere 12 hours after her abduction. The investigators knew they were dealing with a malignant narcissist who desperately craved the spotlight. They laid a psychological trap. They organized a massive, highly publicized outdoor memorial service for Sherry. Mourners were encouraged to leave flowers, teddy bears, and handwritten letters at the site. The detectives hid in the shadows, absolutely certain that a killer this arrogant wouldn't be able to resist returning to the scene to claim a sick memento of his handiwork. He never showed. But the torment continued. McKenna pivoted his obsession. He began relentlessly calling the house, specifically demanding to speak with Sherry's sister, Dawn. The calls were obsessive, graphic, and designed to inflict maximum psychological torture. He described to Dawn exactly how her sister had died. He boasted that he had allowed the 17-year-old to choose her own method of execution. He painted a horrific picture of wrapping thick silver duct tape round and round her entire head until her oxygen supply was completely severed. He then began to whisper that Dawn was next. The physical resemblance between the two sisters was striking. Investigators theorized the monster had actually intended to kidnap Dawn on that fateful afternoon and snatch Sherry by mistake. That Dawn Smith was made of iron. Unflinching in the face of the man who suffocated her sister, she answered every single call. She kept him talking, listening to his madness, praying he would let a detail slip. And finally, the monster's ego tripped him up. He grew lazy. He stopped using the device to distort his voice. And during one particularly chilling conversation, he confidently asked Dawn, "Have you heard about Deborah May Helmick, the 10-year-old? Am I speaking?" Richland County. On June 14th, exactly 2 weeks after Sherry was taken, a 9-year-old girl named Deborah was snatched from her front yard in nearby Richland County. A silver car had violently accelerated toward the plain child. A man had dragged her into the cab and sped off into the afternoon. 8 days later, the caller contacted the Smith family again, providing the exact coordinates to find the little girl's body, cementing the terrifying reality that a serial killer was operating in the county. But the ultimate downfall of the killer did not come from his voice. It came from the very document he used to torture the family, Sherry's last will and testament. Forensic experts brought the handwritten letter into a sterile laboratory. They utilized a piece of technology known as an electrostatic detection device. This machine applies an electrical charge and toner to paper, revealing the invisible, microscopic indentations left behind by a pen pressing down on the sheet above it on a notepad. As the toner swept across Sherry's final goodbye, faint, ghostly lines began to appear. It wasn't a confession. It was a mundane list. Someone had used the notepad to jot down a series of names and phone numbers. One phone number, though missing a single digit, stood out. Detectives manually dialed every possible numerical combination until, finally, the line connected. A young man answered. When detectives pressed him about any ties to South Carolina, he provided the names of his parents, Ellis and Sharon Shepard, a couple whose primary residence sat a mere 15 miles from the Smith family driveway. The police tracked down the Shepards. The couple confirmed they had been away on a long vacation during the exact window of Sherry's abduction. The detectives pressed play on the recording of the undistorted voice from the phone calls. The Shepards gasped. The identification was immediate and absolute. The voice belonged to the man they had hired to house sit their property while they were out of town. a 35-year-old local with a deeply troubling history of harassment and indecent exposure. His name was Larry Jean Bell. The shepherds recounted how, upon their return, Bell had seemed highly agitated, vibrating with a manic energy, intensely fixated on the news of the missing local teenager. Ellis Shepherd looked at the electrostatic printout of the phone numbers and confirmed that it was the emergency contact list he had personally written out and left on the kitchen counter for Bell. The pieces slammed together with terrifying clarity. Bell hadn't taken Sherry to a dark basement or an abandoned warehouse. He had dragged the terrified teenager into the comfortable, suburban home of his employers, using their sanctuary as his personal torture chamber, confident that the police would never think to search a respectable family's house. On June 27th, 28 days after Bob Smith watched his daughter pull into the driveway, heavily armed tactical units kicked down the door and dragged Larry Jean Bell out in handcuffs. His trial was a circus of the absurd. Bell screamed at the judge, spouted religious nonsense, and desperately tried to paint himself as legally insane. The jury saw right through the theatrical madness. It took them less than an hour of deliberation to sentence him to death. A year later, the hammer fell again for the murder of little Deborah May Helmet. On October 4th, 1996, Larry Jean Bell was strapped into the heavy oak of the electric chair. When asked for his final words, the man who had spent hours tormenting families over the phone finally had nothing to say. The silence he left behind is the only justice a monster like that deserves. Thank you for listening. Keep your porch lights on, stay vigilant, and remember that sometimes the most dangerous things in the dark are the people trying to pull you into it. Good night.